While the refugee crisis is straining public services and security forces in Europe, Israel is doing all it can to isolate itself.
It's not only a fence, it's a kind of a whole system. You need the electronic fence, which give you the alert.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announces at the weekly cabinet meeting the fence was meant to keep at bay not only militants, but also migrants and smugglers.
In the late 2000s, Israel faced a crisis unlike anything in its modern history, when tens of thousands of African migrants, primarily Eritreans and Sudanese, flooded across the Sinai border. By January 2012, over 50,000 migrants had entered Israel, an influx that Israeli leaders warned was a serious threat to the nation's future. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that without a new barrier, Israel would face a flood of illegal migrants from Africa, something much worse than Sinai terrorists. From a trickle in 2006, this wave grew into a surge, overwhelming border towns and turning the southern neighborhoods of Tel Aviv into makeshift camps. Local residents and officials cried out for help as the government scrambled to respond. In the first half of 2012, nearly 9,600 Africans crossed illegally, but the next year only 34 managed to do so, a staggering 99% reduction. In a remarkable turn, Israel implemented a series of measures that reduced illegal crossings by nearly 100%, leaving many wondering, how did they do it? Well, today we reveal how Israel solved the immigration crisis, and why their approach holds lessons for nations worldwide. Although the period from 1948 to 1956 saw numerous attempts by Palestinians to cross into Israel, often leading to violent clashes with border guards, it was in the late 2000s that the country's concerns really took off. The centerpiece of Israel's crackdown was the construction of a massive new barrier. Between 2010 and 2013, Israel built a 245-kilometer, 152-mile, high-tech fence along its border with Egypt. According to the Times of Israel, the final 245-kilometer stretch, from Rafah to Eilat, was completed in 2013 at a cost of approximately 1.6 billion Israeli shekels, around $450 million. One of the largest projects in recent Israeli history. Within a few years, the first 230 kilometers of the fence were finished, but the construction of the final 15 kilometers, which form the southwest boundary between Egypt and Israel, took an additional year and a half. The rough terrain of the region around Eilat, with deep valleys and hard rock, was the cause of this delay. This particular section also happened to be the most popular infiltration route. However, this tactic was actually much longer in the making than people realize. In 2002, Israel began constructing a security barrier to protect its innocent men, women, and children from the deadly threat of bombings. However, this infrastructure soon evolved into a broader measure aimed at controlling and reducing illegal immigration, transforming the barrier's primary purpose from solely security to also addressing migration challenges. Over 17 years, Israel invested about 6 billion Israeli shekels in all new border fences. This barrier was designed to address multiple threats, but primarily to curb the African migrant surge. And it worked almost overnight. In the first half of 2012, nearly 9,600 Africans crossed illegally. After the fence's completion, only 34 did so in the first half of 2013, a staggering 99% reduction. By 2016, just 11 migrants had managed to slip through. Prime Minister Netanyahu proudly declared that Israel had halted the infiltration, and even promoted the fence as a model, later cited by President Trump in planning his border wall with Mexico. While groundbreaking in its approach, these measures were met with fierce criticism and concern. The fence itself is actually two parallel barriers built by the Israelis, one of barbed wire fence within Gaza and a 10-foot-high metal smart fence packed with surveillance sensors along the Israel border line. Alongside the barrier, Israel enacted tough laws to deter and punish illegal entry. In 2012, the Knesset passed the anti-infiltration law, allowing the government to send anyone caught without legal status or who overstayed a visa to special detention centers. Thousands of Africans were rounded up and held at Saharanim prison, or a desert camp called Halat. Under this law, single men could be detained for up to 3 years. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the detention policy as unconstitutional, leading to the creation of Halat, a semi-open camp where around 1,800 migrants were required to check in daily but could leave during the day. Interior Minister Eli Yishai branded migrants infiltrators and compared them to a disease. warning they posed an existential threat to Israel. Netanyahu warned that a migration wave of up to 1 million could destroy Israel's character. Critics argued that these laws were inhumane, but the government insisted that they were needed to defend the Jewish and democratic nature of the state. Israel also employed incentives to encourage migrants to leave voluntarily. In 2013, following the independence of South Sudan in 2011, Israel offered financial assistance to Sudanese and other migrants to encourage their voluntary return home. Israel quietly paid $1,250 per family and $5,000 per individual to Sudanese and other migrants to make their return home easier. Thousands accepted the offer. Then, in October 2017, Israel declared that it will begin deporting citizens of Sudan and Eritrea to an unidentified third country in Africa that has consented to take them in, which was generally assumed to be Rwanda and Uganda. The Supreme Court, however, ruled that all deportations of Sudanese and Eritrean nationals be halted because the Israeli government was unable to verify which nations had consented to cooperate in deportation arrangements. NGOs argued that Rwanda was not a safe destination and that deportees could face abuse or persecution. Although Israel's courts intervened, with the High Court ruling that forcible deportations were unconstitutional, nonetheless, Israel has still been transferring these citizens to Uganda through voluntary means since 2013. In April 2018, Netanyahu canceled the UN-brokered resettlement agreement due to a right-wing backlash. The episode left approximately 39,000 to 40,000 African migrants in limbo. By contrast, in 2017, Israel quietly resettled a few thousand, about 4,000 deported to other countries and another 4,000 returning home, without the same controversy. But what were the effects of all this? The aftermath? Was it all good, or were there negatives as well? The result of Israel's measures was clear. Almost no new illegal crossings happened after 2013. The influx of African migrants was all but halted, and the population within Israel stabilized. According to Al Jazeera, by 2017, government data estimated around 27,500 Eritreans and 7,800 Sudanese asylum seekers, roughly 40,000 people, many of whom were women and children of the original migrants. NGOs, however, believe the total peaked closer to 60,000, including dependents. Most of these migrants live in South Tel Aviv, where Stand With Us reports that by 2018, approximately 90% of an estimated 38,000 migrants were concentrated in the area. This sudden influx placed immense strain on local resources, and allegations of abuse soon ramped up. According to a 2019 report by the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants, inspectors from Israel's Population Authority have physically assaulted asylum seekers and, in certain instances, have prevented them from submitting an asylum request or from using a phone as required by law. During this time, South Tel Aviv's already impoverished neighborhoods swelled to 5 or 6 times their original size. The city's budget increased significantly to cover education, welfare, and healthcare needs. One hospital alone reported an additional $10 million in costs for migrant care. Social tensions spiked as well. Right-wing groups held rallies demanding deportation, while activists organized counter-protests. In 2014, over 10,000 migrants marched on the Knesset, chanting, "We need protection. We are asylum seekers. And we are refugees." Protesters even burned the interior minister's photograph, showing the deep divisions this issue caused within Israeli society. These cries were powered for many by the fear of facing life-threatening persecution if they were forced to return to their countries, which poses the question of whether Israel's approach managed to find the right balance between what was accepted beyond its asylum policies and legal requirements. To understand Israel's methodology, it's important to recognize that its legal immigration system is largely based on the law of return, which mainly grants citizenship to Jewish people. This law was enacted by Israel on July 5, 1950, and grants all Jewish people the right to immigrate to the country and obtain immediate citizenship. But non-Jewish immigration and asylum requests are tightly restricted. Israel's refugee system is limited. Out of tens of thousands of African applicants, almost none have received full refugee status for many years. The number is often reported to be below 0.5%. In fact, for a long time, Israel largely ignored asylum requests altogether, until a 2013 law briefly prompted the government to review cases. Even then, only a few hundred individuals, mostly children and survivors of torture, were recognized. In 2020, the Supreme Court finally ruled that Eritreans fleeing indefinite military service qualify as refugees, but the vast majority remain with only temporary permits or none at all. In huge contrast, Israel annually welcomes tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants, around 30,000 per year in the late 2010s under the law of return. It also admits legal foreign workers on strict visas for farming, caregiving, and other roles. The asylum seekers from Africa, however, fall outside these criteria. The government contends most are economic migrants rather than genuine refugees fleeing persecution, a stance critics say ignores the real dangers and fears many face in their home countries. So, while many viewed Israel's aggressive measures as a bold and effective response to its migration challenges, some even citing it as a model for other countries, this approach also sparked intense political debates and raised human rights concerns. Supporters celebrated the crackdown as a necessary step to ensure national security and preserve the country's Jewish identity, often framing migrants as threats to social cohesion. On the other hand, critics argued that these policies dehumanized vulnerable populations and undermined fundamental human rights. The aggressive crackdown started debate both within Israel and internationally. Many are firm in their stance that Israeli officials repeatedly dehumanized the migrants. Foreign Minister Gilad Erdan and Interior Minister Ari Deri bluntly told asylum seekers they faced only two options: leave voluntarily or sit in jail. Even some Israeli doctors challenged the policies. A high court petition argued that African children deserved education and a right to work, just like Israeli citizens. Abroad, human rights organizations condemned Israel's actions. UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, expressed outrage, warning of Israel's painful history of migration and exile, and emphasizing that refugees do not flee out of choice. Amnesty International labeled the deportation plans a cruel and misguided abandonment of responsibility, while Human Rights Watch highlighted how Israeli leaders had labeled asylum seekers infiltrators, undermining democratic values. Media reports in Israel and abroad echoed these fears. In 2018, dozens of NGOs signed protest letters warning that sending migrants to Rwanda was dangerous and that such removals would violate international law. And the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom later ruled in November 2023 that the Rwanda policy was unlawful because of this exact risk. The Israeli Supreme Court also stepped in, striking down parts of the detention law and ordering the closure of Halat. Nonetheless, Israel overall prioritized security over open asylum policies. Politically, there was a broad consensus to maintain strict controls. Center and right-wing parties correspondingly accepted the measures to preserve the country's Jewish majority. In such a heated back and forth, it's clear now that many nations kept an eye on the situation. Some were flat out against the measures, while others remained quiet, leading many to think that these nations may be quietly planning something similar themselves. So, has this happened? And if not, could it? Simply put, has Israel's approach become a global blueprint? Well, some world leaders have indeed taken notice. In 2015, Hungary and Bulgaria sought advice from Israel on building their own fences. As thousands of migrants began to enter the two states from the Middle East and North Africa, leaders from both countries were quick to contact Jerusalem. Poland's recent barrier along the Belarus border was explicitly modeled on Hungary's fence at the Serbia border, reflecting Israel's strategy of walls and patrols. Also, President Trump even cited the Sinai barrier as an inspiration for the US-Mexico wall. However, there are still significant differences. Poland and Hungary built fences at the EU's borders primarily to deter Muslim refugees, often defying EU asylum rules. Israel, by contrast, is outside Europe and categorizes African migrants differently. Poland's government violated EU refugee quotas and faced court rebukes, while Hungary has labeled migrants as Islamic invaders. Israel similarly framed migrants as a demographic threat to its Jewish identity, a concept rooted in its unique historical context. Effectiveness also varies. Israel's walls and laws significantly reduced illegal crossings, almost to zero, though critics argue that no fence can stop people fleeing war forever. Israel's small size and its ability to detain and pressure a few thousand migrants made its approach more manageable than in large European countries. Human rights groups emphasize that Western democracies must balance security needs with legal obligations. For example, Poland's controversial pushbacks at the Belarus border drew European outcry. just as Israel faced UN criticism over its deportation plans. Whichever way you look at it, people are always going to flee war-torn countries or nations that deny them their basic human rights. And it will typically be neighboring countries that feel the brunt of this. But it is how the country handles these challenges that matters. By every measure, Israel nearly eliminated illegal migration from Africa. After 2013, the influx virtually ceased, and the number of undocumented migrants stabilized or declined. Its combination of a massive fence, tough laws, and incentives achieved a dramatic reduction in crossings. However, this approach remains deeply controversial. It exposes Israel's unique dilemma: how to uphold both its Jewish identity and democratic values. So again, can other nations replicate this model if they want to? Well, the answer is extremely complex. On one hand, Israel demonstrated that fortification and strict policies can effectively halt a migrant flow. On the other, it raised urgent questions about refugee rights and humanitarian responsibilities. The global debate continues. Is Israel's strategy an effective security lesson or a warning of how far a country will go in pursuit of its goals? As seen in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere, history suggests that walls alone may fall short if the root causes of migration are not addressed. In the end, Israel's crackdown is a story of huge contrasts, a security success shadowed by humanitarian controversy. Its experience serves as both a cautionary tale and a provocative example, fueling ongoing debates among policymakers and human rights advocates worldwide. What about how Poland solved the immigration crisis?